Glory, hallelujah, amen. Hallelujah, thine the glory, revive us again.
All right, thank you, Tom. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
We have been talking about being the salt of the earth and the light of the world. We've been primarily focused on salt. And, past few weeks we've talked about everything, about the different purposes that salt had and all the reasons why salt mattered and how valuable it was. And today I want to talk about a very crucial aspect of salt, and that is the ability for salt to heal. How it is that salt heals us. And, it's been used since ancient times. But primarily the reason why I want to go into how and why salt heals is because it matters in the context of what Jesus was telling the people when he said for us to be the salt of the earth. It matters when we think about the fact that Jesus was bestowing upon us something. He was giving us something when he gave us his spirit, when he said that he was going to send the disciples out and he wanted us to call people to him. Like the song we sang earlier about drawing men to Jesus. That word draw, it has a meaning in the context of salt because the principles of salt matter if we look at it the right way. The title of the sermon today is Salt in the Wound. Salt in the wound. Now, many of us, I'm sure, have heard this term, this terminology where it talks about salt in the wound. And you think about, well, what does it exactly mean? Today, if you were to say you're pouring salt in the wound or you're rubbing salt in the wound, essentially it's like you're taking an already bad situation and you're making it that much more painful, right? You're making it worse. Last week, we were with the kids. My son's friend Spencer came over. He was educating me and Kendall on what an idiom was, right? And the fact that an idiom is actually a phrase or a sentence that just by looking at the words that are in it, you wouldn't necessarily know what the real meaning is. Like it's, earlier it was raining cats and dogs. Like you kind of have to know the context to really understand that there's really no cats or dogs out there because it's raining, right? No, you understand that that's an idiom, okay? And so to rub salt in the wound is actually an idiom. It means something today, but even more than that, the term rubbing salt in the wound in language has kind of taken a turn. It's kind of changed over time, right? Doesn't actually mean what it used to mean. It was actually considered a good thing. It was a very painful thing, but it was necessary if you wanted to live. In ancient times, when they would rub salt in the wound, it actually was kind of a matter of life or death. And as his disciples, as followers of Christ, it's important that we understand that us being the salt of the earth is kind of a matter of life and death. It's not just this optional thing, and we're going to get into that here in a few passages that we're going to look at, talking directly about this. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 9. If you're wondering, well, why does he keep looking behind me? Well, it's because I don't have actually anything in front of me. We're having some technical difficulties. So I'm going to be reading some of this along with you, but it's for my benefit so that I can keep up with you all. You guys are much faster than me on the reading. Matthew chapter 9, starting in verse 10. A few verses here says, while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? On hearing this, Jesus said, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. There's a couple of things here. In just these few verses, Jesus is dealing with the Pharisees, and understand the Pharisees were the religious establishment at the time, the church-going people, the people who were devout in their ways. And they asked this question. They said, well, why is Jesus over there hanging out with those sinners, those people who are considered undesirable, those people who are considered in some ways beneath? And so I always find it kind of fascinating how they wouldn't just go walk up to Jesus and ask him, right? They're going to ask his friends, they're going to ask, the guys who are kind of hanging with him, like, why are you following this guy? This guy claims to be this great teacher. He claims to be the one who's to come. He is claiming all these things. He's supposed to have all this power. But if he's so great, why is he hanging out with them? Why is he hanging out with those people? Now, and, it's important that we give this context too, because we think, well, who would be the tax collectors today? Who would be the sinful people that the Pharisees are questioning Jesus about hanging out with? You think about today, tax collectors aren't exactly the worst people that we can hang out with today, right? They're not exactly anybody who's ever had to pay taxes, been behind on taxes, and it wasn't quite that bad. It wasn't like, oh my goodness, I'll, don't want to be seen with them. I didn't want to be seen with them because I didn't like what they were going to tell me about how much money I owed. But it had nothing to do with their righteousness or moral, integrity or anything like that. Who would those people be today? And we're going to answer that here in just a second, but I kind of want to focus on this part where Jesus tells them, I didn't come to hang out with all the righteous people. I came to hang out with the people who were sinners. And he says, go learn what this means, that I desire mercy rather than sacrifice. What is Jesus saying to them when he says, I desire mercy rather than sacrifice? What he's saying is, your worship, your devotion, that sacrifice that you brought because you bring it all the time, because you know this is the right thing to do, that actual sacrifice that you brought is not in and of itself what God desires. What he desires is for you to show mercy. What is he talking about? I desire you to show compassion. I want you to understand this, because when you can understand that mercy matters more than you bringing your offering as a sacrifice, then you can understand why me hanging out with these sinful people, why that matters. See, the religious establishment then, they had ideas and these very strict rules about cleanliness, and there's a reason why you don't associate with certain people. There's a reason why you don't rub elbows, and you don't hang out, you don't fellowship, you don't regularly engage with these people. And it was because they were more concerned about how it looked and perception and their comfort and the things that they were, trying to show for themselves instead of actually being that salt of the earth, actually being effective. It's interesting. There's the idea of mercy here that was brought up, and you think, well, what is mercy? How would you even define mercy? What does mercy look like? He's calling them and he's challenging them to seek after mercy rather than just their religious rituals. What does that look like today? He's saying you need to be more interested in the people than making sure that you look good when you show up here on Sunday morning. He's saying that the activities and the duties that come with worship and that come with your religious practices and principles, those things matter far less to God than if you did those while you were also showing mercy to people, while you were also showing compassion to people. See, everybody knew who the lepers were. It wasn't hard. You could see them. You could smell them. You could tell that they were lepers. You could see people who were sick. But the question is, well, why did no one spend time with the sick people? Why did no one engage? And why were these people outcast in the first place? Why were they outcast? And we can look back then and think, well, it's not as though it wasn't actually contagious. Somebody who was blind, by being in a relationship with him, you weren't going to get it. And we look back on that now, and we think, wow, those foolish Pharisees 2,000 years ago, their ideas and these concepts that you need to steer clear of all these people with these illnesses and diseases, or these sinful people, I can't be that close to them. But what about today? What about those people today? Who would the sinful people be today that maybe we just don't want to get that close to? Another passage I want to look at, Matthew chapter 8, starting in verse 1. We see here yet another example of Jesus coming in contact and having a relationship and an encounter with somebody who was sick. When Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said. Be clean. Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, see that you don't tell anyone, but go show yourselves to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them. There's two things we want to kind of pull out of this. The first is that this idea that he says, don't go tell anybody, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them. And that was interesting. I was reading on this because I wanted to really make sure I understood it, but I wanted to make sure I could explain it in the best possible way. And the thing about this passage where he tells them to go show yourself, he says, don't go tell anybody, but go show yourself. What he's saying is this: the priests, those who were considered the authorities of the religious establishment back then, those who were considered credible, he says, go show yourself to them. See, the priests couldn't heal anybody. They didn't actually have the power to heal, but they were expected to diagnose and determine whether or not you've actually been made clean. Now, because he had leprosy, and this was described as any significant skin disease back then, not necessarily what we would know of as leprosy. It could have been anything. Whatever it was obvious that he had a skin problem. And so, as a result, he was not allowed to be associated with anybody else. He had to be an outcast. He carried that shame. He carried that feeling of being undesired and unloved. Even his family was not allowed under Jewish law to be in touch with him. And he says, go show yourself to the priest. Now, there was a couple of reasons why he did this. He told him to do this. Number one, by going and showing himself to the priest then could determine that, okay, this man is now clean. He is now allowed to go back and become a part of regular society. He's no longer an outcast. He has been cleansed. Now, part two of this is when he tells him, hey, you go and take the offer the gift that Moses commanded. Here's what this was. Back then, they had a custom, and this is what the gift was. Basically, they would take 2 doves, right? And these 2 doves, they would bring them as an offering, and one of them they would kill, right? And they would kill and they would spill the blood, and they would put it in this water, right? Then they would take the second dove, and they would dip them in this water mixed with the blood from the other dove. And then they would release this second dove who lived because he didn't have to be sacrificed. But the idea of dipping him in the blood and the water was essentially to signify that because this bird died, you're able to go free. So that's why they always tell them, bring two. So what he was doing was he was doing two things at once here. He was putting the priest in a corner. He was saying, guess what? The priest didn't necessarily want to acknowledge who Jesus was, but it was undeniable who Jesus was because of what he did. He cleaned this man. That's why he wanted to go see the priest. But the idea of the dove, and if you really think about it, this was a foreshadowing. This was Jesus' way of saying that people are made clean through me. People are brought into a relationship with God in spite of their sin through me. The idea of the one dove being killed and having to bleed and being put in the water, that's what we do when we take on Jesus in baptism, right? We understand it because someone else's blood and their death and burial and resurrection, because of what Jesus did, that is what gives us what we have in our relationship with God. That's the mercy. That's the grace. And he wants him to go show himself to the priest. But what's so interesting about all this, that even as we understand that, what's so important that we understand is that Jesus did something even before all this. He did something that was considered taboo, that was considered wrong, that obviously they would have made an argument, they would have kicked up a fuss about it, and that was Jesus actually touched this man with leprosy. He wasn't even supposed to touch him. We think about that salt of the earth, that the principles of salt and how salt works. It's important that we understand that Jesus was showing mercy on this man by touching him. Salt, in order to be effective, in order for the principles of salt to even be able to be used to heal, it has to come in direct contact with the organism that is healed. That's why that whole idea of salt in the wound, what does salt do? Salt goes in and it takes that cell and it draws out that bacteria, that infection. But it can't do it at a distance. It has to come in direct contact with that disease, with that illness, with that bacteria, with that infection. What we see here is that Jesus, he's telling them, he's showing them that you have to go beyond just your traditions and what you think of as being a good person, being a religious person, being a church-going person, being a devout Christian. You have to go a step beyond to be like me. Because I'm not afraid to get dirty. Because I'm not afraid to touch something that's dirty. I'm not afraid to be in relationship with something that is considered unclean. Because I understand what it is to be salt. I have to come in touch, direct contact with things that are unclean, things that are dirty. We think about ourselves and what it is that we are expected to do if we're going to be the salt of the earth. And, it's interesting. I'll share this story. This is a run-of-the-mill paper cut. In case you all hadn't seen it, my wife, she got cut. I told you every time, for whatever reason, every Sunday, when I'm looking for an example of something, like how can I really relate this and make this practical in real life? And surely enough, I get a text. And see, she's not even downstairs, so I only have to talk behind her back today. She's right here. She gives me this text. She says, yeah, I cut myself. I thought, okay. She's like, it's bad. I'm like, well, clearly you didn't cut your texting hand, And, she cut herself. It was with a box cutter. But the thing about it is, when she was bandaging, I saw the stitches, right? And it's interesting because I, offered to help, and she's like, no, I got it. I was giving her suggestions, and she begrudgingly took one of them on how to. And I told her, I said, you don't have to take it. I'm a professional, okay? Like, I have been cut so many times. I've had so many stitches. We went to go visit my sister yesterday, and she talked about how for about 4 or 5 years in my childhood, every summer, I got stitches. Like, I got stitches here. I got some in my armpit. Long story. We'll talk about it another time. But I understand a few things about being cut. And the one thing you understand about being cut is you got to clean that thing out. We talked about that salt. Salt is no good to a cut if you don't have the right concentration, because it has to draw that stuff out, right? And when we think about what it means to draw that sickness out, even when Jesus was talking about how I didn't come for the healthy, if I, put some salt on some salt water, some saline or something on my wife's other hand, the good hand, the texting hand, that's not going to do anything. She's got to clean the one that's cut. She's got to clean the one that's dirty. I was thinking about this last night, and I was like, I'm going to share this story with you all. I remember after coming back from Ohio State, I sat out for a couple of years before returning to school. And at one point, I was going to community college in Cincinnati State. And I moved downtown. In Cincinnati, this is called Over the Rhine. It's called the Over the Rhine District. It's the project, right? And it was, I worked downtown at the time. And so there was a young man who, he studied the Bible. He wanted to get baptized. So he got baptized. And he was reaching out to different friends. And I decided, you know what? It would be very good for us as a church, our congregation. We had about 800 or 900 members at the time. It was a pretty large church. But we didn't have any presence in the project. We didn't have any presence in these neighborhoods. And so we got down there, and I actually moved. And I stayed with him for a little while. And so because I worked there, I wanted to actually live in this environment where we were working on starting this ministry. And so after a few months, people started showing up. People started coming to church. We started our own little, Bible study group that we had there. I cooked, used what little bit of skill I had. We would cook meals. We'd have people over. And it was so painful because after a few months, there were people, they got baptized, and it was growing. It was a growing ministry. So after a few months, there was some of the leadership in the church there pulled me aside. And keep in mind, I was still kind of reeling a little bit from some of the disappointments about how I left the campus ministry that I started at Ohio State up in Columbus. And so I was hoping that, since we were doing things the right way, since we were really going about the job of being disciples and making disciples and reaching people in this otherwise unreached part of the city where there was really no presence of the church. We had this meeting with leadership, and they said, listen, we want you to stop doing what you're doing. And I said, why? Well, I'm, kind of shocked. I thought maybe there was some good reason or there was a logical explanation for this. They said, here's the problem. They said, this ministry is growing, but we can't really take care of them. And I said, what do you mean take care of them? I'm like, they've been taking care of themselves. Like, what do you mean take care of them? They said, well, but they're a really needy ministry. And you have a lot of people who maybe they come out of abusive homes or they come from broken families, or many of them have used drugs. Some of them were drug dealers. I didn't notice at the time, but one of the guys who I was studying the Bible with, I found out later when we started talking about his life, that he was a very big-time drug dealer. And they were like, we don't really want those type of people because we can't do anything for them, and you're not equipped. They said, you're just 21 years old, 20 years old at the time. They said, you're just 20 years old, and you don't really have, this is not where you're from. This isn't your neighborhood. You didn't grow up here. These aren't your people. You need to do something different because we can't take care of them. We don't want them. We're not ready for them. And I was hurt. Even telling this story, it hurts all over again. It kind of felt like when you're maybe, you ever hear about abusive relationships and then the child is just a part of it. And they feel like, well, what can I do about it? That's kind of how I felt. I was like, I felt powerless to do anything about it, but I was also hurt that the leadership of the church, and I look back on it now, it was really simple. They didn't want to get dirty. They didn't want to be a part of getting dirty because you got people that were coming in, and I knew the stories, and some of them were HIV positive. Some of them had, come out of homosexual lifestyles. Some of them would be who we would look at in 2019, and we would consider them the lepers. They were the undesirables. They were the sinners. They weren't the good church-going people. And we have to ask ourselves, why was Jesus spending time with them? But as a church, we had no ministry. We had no focus. There was no emphasis being put on reaching those people. They told me, they said, that wasn't really where you're from. But what they didn't understand, I was one generation removed from being from there. My cousins, many of my friends, people I went to school with, this is where they were from. These people were my people. As a church, I look back then and you think, well, man, we can look at that and think, man, that's so unfortunate. That's so misguided and narrow-minded. But fast forward all these years, ask yourself, the Dover Church of Christ, are we willing to deal with the dirty people, the sinful people? Is that who we engage with? When is the last time you spent some time with someone? When's the last time you built a relationship with someone who was considered sinful, a drug addict? Connections is right around the corner. Literally, it's 5 minutes walking here, from here. That's where all of the people who have drug problems, who are seeking recovery, that's where they go. They got them all over the state. Do we care about these people? Or do we consider them the undesirables? Are we afraid it's going to rub off on us? Or do we really want to be the salt of the earth? Because in order to be the salt of the earth, there's going to have to be some pimps and some drug dealers and some prostitutes and some strippers and some people with HIV and some people with AIDS and some people who have felonies. We can't be so antiseptic. It's like the hospital. We go over here to Bay Health, we go over here to Christianity. Guess what? You're going to get some blood on the floor. You're going to get your pretty white uniform dirty if you're doing your job. Jesus touched the leper. When's the last time you've actually reached out and touched a leper? Why does salt water help wounds heal? Because it comes in direct contact with them. Even as I was preparing this, I was thinking about this story. And it was weird because it's like in telling the story, sometimes I can almost remove myself and tell it as a story, but it's emotional for me because it hurt. Because I remember the responses. I remember the face that he had when I told him about the meeting that we had and how hurt he was that this church that had brought him to the truth, that had taught him so much, that they didn't care enough, that they didn't want to be in the projects. Sometimes we only want to bring in doctors to the hospital. We only want to hire the biggest and the best and the brightest doctors. We don't actually want to heal anybody. We don't actually want to put in the time and give therapy and recovery to anyone. But we can't be the salt of the earth if we're not willing to do that. Look at this last passage here in Luke chapter 7. We'll read through this whole narrative here, starting verse 36. It says, When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, so she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. Tell me, teacher, he said. 2 people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii, the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. You have judged correctly, Jesus said. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little, loves little. Then Jesus said to her, your sins are forgiven. The other guests began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. We see here yet another example of somebody who may not have carried some infectious disease or something that made them appear to be dirty or unclean, but everybody knew this sinful woman's lifestyle. They used to call them women of the night or whatever, term that they would use to talk about these women who, because they had no other means or they saw no other way, they sold their bodies to men to be able to survive. But there was no mercy shown. Again, Jesus is questioned, but more than Jesus being questioned, we see a pattern of behavior here with Jesus. Jesus was constantly coming in direct contact with the people that the religious establishment didn't want to touch. The religious establishment, those people who were the devout Jews, they didn't want to have any part in dealing with these people. And I keep saying that word, these people, not as an insult, but because, let's face it, if you're not willing to deal with people directly, if you're not willing to come in contact, or if you think you're better, then guess what? You look at them as those people, as other, as not one of us. And yet Jesus is making something very clear here, that if we are to be the salt of the earth, if we are to make our lives as Christians worth anything, that we ourselves have to be willing to imitate him. And imitate him in the way that he was willing to deal with those people. Those people. For the salt to be effective, it must come in direct contact with the infected area. It says the person who loves little, that comes from being forgiven little. And sometimes our lack of mercy and our lack of love is because we forget just how much we've been forgiven of. When we love so little, when we have so little mercy and compassion, it's because we can't seem to put ourselves in that other person's shoes. It's because we seem to forget that your laziness, your self-righteousness, your immorality, your, lying, that is just as bad. And in some cases, because it's so seemingly benign and it's deceitful, sometimes that is actually worse than that person who knows that they're a sinner. We ask the question sometimes, well, what's going on with the church? Why is the church in decline? There's literally countless articles written and books written about the church being in decline. You know why the church is in decline? Because nobody wants to come in direct contact with sinners. You know, I asked the question in theory, well, what happens if, next week, next Sunday, we show up here, and there's 20 people that show up in here. People that we don't know, people that maybe we don't see them every week, but we know something about them. Maybe they tell us because they're open about it. Maybe they tell us that they have AIDS or that they're homosexuals or that they're drug addicted. Maybe they have some chemical dependency. Maybe they've just gotten out of jail and they've got a criminal record because they were mean, because they were hateful, because they did something that was totally corrupt and immoral. Would you move to another seat? Probably not if anybody was watching. Probably not if, you're going to be exposed, because certainly we wouldn't want to do that. We wouldn't want that on our record. I'm going to talk about this next week about the chairs. The truth is, I want to make sure that the Ray Bucks made it back. I didn't want to take the Ray Bucks chairs back then and they come show up Sunday and be like, what happened to my chairs? But I'll explain that next Sunday about the missing chairs. I'll give you some details on that. But the fact of the matter is, part of it, I'll give you a little preview. Part of the reason why there's less chairs in here, because we need to come in more contact with each other. I don't have to ask, well, how close are you? How willing are you to put your hands on and get dirty and come in contact with people who are sinners, who we might consider sinners? You know why? You barely hug and come in contact with those who are not. We don't even want to get that close. I don't want you too close to me. And I'm not saying, guilty as charged. I like my space. Okay? I like my space. I'm not advocating that we all just, be shoulder to shoulder at all times. But what I'm saying is, in order for us to truly be who Christ expects us to be, we've got to build some relationships. And it can't just be the friendly, the kind, the ones that are always comfortable. Salt doesn't compromise. Salt is going to do what salt does. It doesn't change. But it's only effective when it comes directly in contact with the sinner, with the disease, with the dirty, with that which needs to be clean. All of our Bible study and all the things that we learn, all the things we teach one another, all of the Wednesday Bible studies and ladies' Bible classes and all of the Bible discussion groups we have in our homes and all of our Bible reading and prayer and everything that we do, it is only as good as our willingness to expose ourselves and be close to those who need to be clean. Are we willing to do that? A few questions as we finish up here. As a church, are we more concerned with staying clean or healing the sick? Are we willing to get dirty to save a life? I point this out there because I think of hospitals, how when people come into the hospital in trauma because they're bleeding, no doctor who's capable, no doctor worth their salt, or anybody who's a healthcare professional, nobody looks at it and says, ooh, well, maybe I should, wait for somebody else to come along. I've only been working at this hospital for 25 years as a surgeon, but I don't know about this one. So many of us, we have the experience. We have the Holy Spirit. We have the ability, but sometimes we're more concerned about being clean. See, we want to make sure that everything gets done right. We don't want any distractions, interruptions. Everything has to be on time. Everything, the chairs have to be right. Who moved my chair? Everything. We're concerned about all of these things and all this order, and we want everything to be perfect. We don't want church to start 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later. We don't want, the preacher to get up there with a pink shirt on or whatever it is, right? We want things to be right. But do we actually want to heal anybody? Do we actually want to be a part of the solution that is bringing the sinners? There's only so many more people that we can get to be a part of the church that aren't actually sinners. That people who don't know what it is to live a clean, holy life. When we think about how the Bible calls us to be holy and pure and blameless, well, it's kind of like a doctor, right? It's the reason why you go and you get your immunizations. It's the reason why you wash your hands. It's the reason why you wear your mask. Yeah, you yourself need to be healthy. But you've already seen grace. You've already been saved. Your holiness is not what is for God. It is your willingness to go out and sacrifice. That's what makes you effective. We read that passage. Well, but Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not go out and do all these great things in your name? And he says, away from me, I never knew you. Well, why don't you recognize me, Lord? Because I hired doctors who were going to save people. I hired doctors who were going to come in touch with blood, who were going to come in touch with diseases, and people were going to come in here coughing. People are going to come in here with viruses. And I hired you to administer the care, not to judge them, not to be concerned about how they got the disease, not to let somebody else take care of that. You are called to go and make disciples. But how are we ever going to do that if we never come in touch with sin? If we're worried about being clean? How often do I have direct contact or friendship with lepers who will reach the unclean in my life if I won't touch them? And I point out the unclean in my life because guess what? It doesn't take much. I shared that story about when I was back in Cincinnati, but the fact is, I didn't have to go far. There's people with AIDS and HIV in my family. There's felons in my family. There are drug addicts and drug dealers in my own family, in my own community where I grew up. Some of my best friends, that's the life that they chose, and they did that. You don't have to go far. And the question is, well, then why are they in my life? If not for me to be the person to provide the answer and help them find the cure. Who's going to touch them? Who's going to be the salt that draws out the infection if it's not me? Who am I waiting on to do it? Who am I expecting to come along? Because Jesus sent me. Jesus put that person in my life to be the person to draw out that disease. How can I better understand mercy over sacrifice in a practical way? How can showing mercy to others change my overall faith in God's purpose for my life? Very often, we wonder, in an honest moment, we'll say, well, I know that God has a plan and a purpose for my life, and it's certainly not just to show up here every Sunday and sing and pray and get to know all the people here. There's got to be more than this. There's got to be more. The answer is, guess what? Yeah, there is more. But until you understand mercy, until you understand how much mercy has been shown you, until you understand that the reason why you're healthy and the reason why you're clean is not just so that you can have this great, strong immune system and live this strong life and go exercise and run and eat what you want to do with all. No, the reason why God has shown you mercy is to then go out and show others the same mercy that he has shown you. But you can't do that if you don't come in contact with people. If you don't make a conscious decision that I'm going to befriend, I'm going to get to know, I'm going to be in relationship with other people who don't know what this is. And finally, am I denying the healing power and mercy of Christ? What do I need to do to be a part of that team of doctors? None of us would just openly say, you know what, I don't believe in the power of Christ to heal. I don't believe that God can fix this thing. I don't have faith that Christ and his blood on the cross, his resurrection, I don't believe that that trumps everything. Nobody would say that with their mouth, certainly not in front of a bunch of people who are Christians, because we don't want the pushback. And we may not even think that in the forefront of our minds anyway. But your life, if you're not willing to get dirty, if you're not willing to reach those who are sinful, those people who are considered out there, your life says that actually you don't believe. Your life says, you know what? I don't think there's a cure for this person. I don't think you can come back from that sexual deviancy. I don't believe that you can come back from that hatred or that murder. We see Jesus spending time with these prostitutes. We see Jesus forgiving the man on the cross who places faith in him. Even as he's dying, even as he's bleeding out, he's forgiving a man. He's declaring peace. We won't say it, but what does your life say? Does your life speak to the fact that you believe that those people, and I keep saying it like that, those people, because until we stop with the those people and realize that they're your people, because they're in your life, I have a very simple conviction. If the person knows you and the person is in front of you, if the person is at the gas station pumping gas when you're pumping gas, guess what? It's your responsibility now. That's your people now. That coworker, that's your people now. Do we have this attitude? Because in order for us to really be able to understand and discern, well, what's wrong with the church? Why is it that no one's coming? Because we're not inviting sinners. Because we're not reaching those who need Jesus the most. Because we've forgotten the power that comes with the real relationship with God. If you need prayer, if you're in a place where you understand that this is where you are, but you need help with this, we know that the prayers of the righteous are powerful and effective. As a church, we want to pray for you, pray with you. If you yourself need that healing power because you've never given your life to him, you've never decided, I'm going to follow Christ, I'm going to get baptized, I'm going to make him Lord, and it's not going to be about me and my will, but it's going to be about him and his will. If this is not a decision you've ever made, don't let today go by. Don't let this opportunity pass for you to be able to say, I want to be one of the doctors. I want to get healed so that I can then go out and heal others. There's nothing better, there's nothing more gratifying than when you see somebody and you know somebody who maybe they had a problem, maybe they had an addiction, maybe they had something, and then they go back and they become advocates. We need to be those advocates. If you want to be one of those advocates and you want the prayers of the church, please stand as we sing our song of invitation. Restore my spirit, Lord, I need restore. My heart is weary, please help me.